The story begins with the narrator noticing a repeated issue with their neighbors, Jill and Stephen, using their electric car charger without permission. This was not a trivial problem. It was more than just a small inconvenience. It was a matter of personal property being invaded. The narrator had invested their own money into installing the charger, making it clear to everyone around that it was meant for their use only. However, Jill and Stephen showed no regard for this boundary. They would frequently unplug the narrator's car to charge theirs, disregarding the fact that it was not their property and they had never been given permission to use it. Despite the narrator's polite requests, the issue only seemed to escalate, with the neighbors becoming increasingly dismissive and entitled. When confronted, Stephen laughed off the situation, downplaying it as if it were a minor issue. However, the narrator's frustration grew as they realized the ongoing toll this was taking on their daily life. Not only was the charger being used without permission, but the narrator was also seeing a rising electricity bill as a result. Their ability to use the charger for their own car was constantly interrupted, making it difficult to get to work and attend to other obligations. The more this behavior continued, the more the narrator felt that Jill and Stephen believed they had the right to take what didn't belong to them. The situation became more than just an inconvenience. It became a violation of personal space and ownership. With each passing day, the narrator's frustration grew. They felt the need to take action, but they weren't sure how far they were willing to go to assert their rights. The situation had reached a boiling point, and the narrator realized that they couldn't just let things continue this way. They had tried to reason with Jill and Stephen, but it was clear that a different approach was needed. They knew that if they didn't do something soon, the issue would continue indefinitely, leaving them feeling powerless. After weeks of unresolved tension, the narrator finally decided to involve the authorities. They called the police, reporting the theft of electricity and their charger. This was no longer just a petty disagreement. It was a matter of protecting their property and standing up for their rights. The decision to call the police was not taken lightly, but the narrator was at the end of their patience and determined to resolve the issue once and for all. The police response came swiftly, but Jill's reaction was nothing short of furious. She accused the narrator of being unreasonable and tried to argue that the charger, being located in a shared driveway, was somehow communal property. However, the narrator remained calm and explained that the charger had been paid for entirely out of their own pocket and was connected to their electricity account. The officers, once they examined the evidence, sided with the narrator, debunking Jill's claims. Jill's reaction was defensive, and she continued to argue even as the officers explained the situation. The tension reached a peak when the officers warned her about the consequences of making false reports. Eventually, Jill stormed off, but the matter was far from resolved. The narrator knew that even though the police had intervened, Jill's attitude wouldn't change overnight. They were prepared for more conflict, and after careful consideration, they decided to move the charger inside their garage to prevent any further issues. This was not an easy decision, nor was it a simple process. Relocating the charger required professional help, and it came with a hefty price tag. The narrator felt the financial burden, but ultimately, the peace of mind it offered was worth it. As the professionals completed the installation inside the garage, the narrator hoped that this would put an end to the problem. However, that hope was short-lived. The very next morning, Jill showed up at the narrator's door, demanding to know where her charger had gone. Her attitude was hostile and accusatory, as though the narrator had somehow wronged her. The narrator calmly explained that the charger was their property, and they had moved it for security reasons. Jill's response was filled with outrage, and she even went as far as to accuse the narrator of stealing from her. This was the breaking point for the narrator, and they knew they had to stand firm in their decision. Despite Jill's anger, the narrator refused to back down. They had done everything they could to resolve the situation peacefully, but Jill's entitlement had left them with no choice but to take further action. Little did the narrator know, this would not be the last confrontation with Jill. After the initial confrontation with Jill at the front door, things quickly spiraled into even more tension. Jill, frustrated by the narrator's decision to move the charger inside their garage, didn't take the situation lightly. Her actions escalated beyond mere words, as she refused to accept the boundaries the narrator had set. The next few hours brought a knock on the narrator's door. This time, it wasn't Jill, but two police officers, responding to a call about a missing charger. Jill had apparently reported the charger as stolen, accusing the narrator of theft. The officers arrived, clearly puzzled, but as professionals, they had a duty to investigate. The narrator invited them in, hoping that once again, they could present their side of the story and put the matter to rest. They calmly explained that the charger was their property, purchased and installed at their own expense, and had been moved into the garage for security reasons. As they explained the situation, they presented the receipts for the charger, installation documentation, and even the electricity bills showing the charger was hooked up to their account. The officers listened attentively, though their skepticism was evident. The whole situation seemed absurd. Why would anyone claim to steal a charger when the evidence was so clear? The officers, despite their doubts, didn't immediately voice their concerns, maintaining professionalism in front of the narrator. Meanwhile, Jill stood outside, continuing her barrage of exaggerated claims, her tone growing more desperate as she tried to defend her stance. It was clear that Jill was determined to make the narrator out to be the villain in this situation. Eventually, one of the officers went outside to speak with Jill and assess her claims. The conversation between Jill and the officers became increasingly heated, though the narrator couldn't make out all the details. They could see Jill gesturing wildly, her frustration boiling over as she tried to twist the facts in her favor. After several tense minutes, one of the officers returned to the house, looking at the narrator with a mixture of confusion and resolve. He explained that Jill's accusations were completely unfounded. The police had already informed her that the charger was never hers and that the narrator had every right to move it. The officer made it clear that Jill needed to stop making false claims or face the consequences. The officer warned her that continuing to file baseless reports could lead to legal repercussions for her. Jill's expression shifted from anger to something more akin to realization, but it was clear that her resentment was far from gone. Her face turned pale as she understood the implications of her behavior. The officers were firm, letting her know that if she persisted with her harassment or false accusations, further action would be taken. Jill remained silent for a moment, staring at the officers with a look of quiet fury before she muttered something under her breath and walked away. The officers, satisfied that the situation had been addressed, turned to leave. As the door closed behind them, the narrator stood in the hallway, still processing the series of events that had unfolded. The police had sided with them, and Jill's false accusations had been swiftly debunked. The matter seemed to be over, but the tension lingered in the air. The narrator couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and exhaustion. Despite the intervention, they knew the situation was far from resolved. The police had made it clear that Jill's behavior was unacceptable, but they also recognized that Jill's attitude wouldn't change overnight. The police had done their part, but the narrator was left with the challenge of living next to someone who had shown no regard for their boundaries. As the days passed, the tension didn't dissipate. In fact, it became more palpable. Whenever the narrator crossed paths with Jill in the neighborhood, there was no longer any semblance of cordiality. Jill would glare at them, her eyes cold and filled with resentment. There was no more polite nods or casual greetings, just a silent, simmering animosity. The narrator tried to avoid further confrontation, but they knew that Jill's attitude had shifted from passive-aggressive to outright hostile. Even though the issue with the charger had been resolved, Jill's resentment would likely continue to fester. The narrator began to feel increasingly uncomfortable in their own home, knowing that Jill's bitterness could escalate at any moment. They couldn't let their guard down, especially knowing that Jill had shown she was willing to go to great lengths to push her entitlement. It was clear that the tension between them wasn't just about the charger anymore. It was about a clash of boundaries, values, and mutual respect. The narrator realized that while they had successfully protected their property, there was still the looming challenge of managing the ongoing conflict. They couldn't afford to be complacent. They needed to ensure that their rights were protected not just in this moment, but in the future as well. The last thing they wanted was for Jill to escalate her behavior in ways that could result in more serious consequences. It was with this in mind that the narrator decided to take a proactive step to safeguard their property. They installed security cameras around their home. This was not just about the charger anymore. It was about protecting themselves from any potential retaliation or further interference from Jill and Stephen. The security cameras were a way to keep a watchful eye on their property and ensure that any future incidents would be documented. This move wasn't just about the charger. It was about regaining control over their space and preventing any further intrusion. The decision to install cameras wasn't made lightly. The narrator had already been through enough stress and frustration, and they weren't willing to let anyone take advantage of them any longer. With the cameras in place, the narrator could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that if Jill or Stephen tried to make any moves against them, there would be a clear record of it. More than just security, the cameras gave the narrator a sense of control over their situation, something they had been lacking for so long. For the first time in this whole ordeal, the narrator felt empowered rather than helpless. They had taken steps to protect themselves and their property, and they weren't going to let anyone walk over them again. The cameras weren't just a physical deterrent. They were a symbol of the boundaries the narrator had fought so hard to establish. As time passed, the narrator became more confident in their ability to stand up for themselves. They knew that while the tension with Jill would never fully disappear, they had taken the necessary steps to protect their home and ensure that their rights were respected. Months had passed since the incident with Jill and the charger, but the underlying tension continued to cloud the narrator's daily life. Despite the intervention of the police and the installation of security cameras, the hostility between them and their neighbor, Jill, persisted. Jill's silent disdain was still evident whenever their paths crossed, whether in the driveway, in the neighborhood, or even at local stores. Her cold stares and passive-aggressive behavior had become a part of the narrator's reality. It seemed that no matter what steps they took to protect themselves, Jill was always lurking in the background, ready to stir the pot again. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken animosity, and it began to wear on the narrator's mental well-being. Each day felt like walking on eggshells, uncertain of when Jill might decide to escalate things again. Though the security cameras provided some peace of mind, they also served as a reminder of the constant tension. The narrator no longer felt entirely at ease in their own home. It was as if the boundaries they had so carefully set in place were constantly being tested. One evening, after a particularly draining encounter with Jill outside, the narrator sat in their living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired. They thought about how the simple act of moving the charger had spiraled into such a complicated mess. How had something so small turned into an ongoing battle? The more they reflected, the more they realized that it wasn't just the charger. It was the way Jill had continually undermined their boundaries and tried to force her will upon them. The whole experience had revealed something unsettling. Jill's lack of respect for other people's rights and her willingness to go to extreme lengths to manipulate situations in her favor. The deeper they thought about it, the more the narrator understood the root of their frustration. It wasn't just about the charger, the police intervention, or even the cameras. It was about power, the power to control one's own space, to live without fear of someone else's attempts to infringe upon that space. Jill had tried to take that power away, to force the narrator into a situation where they felt vulnerable and constantly under siege. But by standing firm and protecting their property, the narrator had regained some of that power. Yet, they still felt the weight of Jill's influence in their life. It wasn't easy to simply ignore her. It felt like a constant tug-of-war, with each encounter leaving them feeling drained and exhausted. But despite all of this, the narrator realized they were learning valuable lessons from the experience. They were learning the importance of asserting their rights, of maintaining control over their own space, and of not letting someone else's toxic behavior dictate their actions. The situation had become a battle of wills, but the narrator was no longer content to simply react. They began to take a more proactive approach in dealing with Jill. While they had done everything in their power to prevent further confrontations, by installing the security cameras, by explaining their actions clearly to the police, their peace of mind was still being disturbed by Jill's continued hostility. It became clear that the only way to fully resolve the tension was to confront it head-on. The narrator considered speaking to Jill one final time, to lay down a firm boundary and make it clear that their property was not up for dispute. But the idea of having another face-to-face confrontation was daunting. Jill had already proven herself to be irrational and volatile, and the narrator didn't know if another conversation would make a difference or simply escalate the conflict further. What if Jill became even more aggressive in response? What if this led to a more dangerous confrontation? With these questions swirling in their mind, the narrator hesitated. They couldn't help but wonder if it was worth the risk. Despite their reservations, the narrator knew they couldn't live in fear forever. The current situation wasn't sustainable. They had taken steps to protect themselves. Now it was time to take the next step toward resolving the issue once and for all. They decided that their best course of action would be to involve a mediator, someone who could help facilitate a conversation between them and Jill, someone who could ensure the discussion stayed civil and productive. After some research, the narrator found a local community mediator who specialized in neighborhood disputes. The idea of having a neutral third party involved gave the narrator a sense of relief. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about finding a way to communicate effectively, to make Jill understand the harm her actions had caused, and to establish clear boundaries without resorting to further escalation. The narrator reached out to the mediator and scheduled a meeting. They also sent a letter to Jill, informing her of the upcoming mediation and explaining that they hoped to resolve the issue peacefully and without further conflict. Jill's response came within days, in the form of a terse, one-line message. "I don't need a mediator." The refusal was expected, but the narrator wasn't deterred. They knew that Jill's reaction was a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding responsibility for her actions. The mediator confirmed that Jill had declined to participate, but the offer remained open should she change her mind. The decision to bring a mediator into the equation marked a turning point for the narrator. It was a clear signal that they weren't going to back down from this conflict. They were taking control of the situation and, in doing so, reclaiming their peace of mind. For the first time in a long time, the narrator felt a sense of calm. They had tried everything they could to prevent conflict with Jill. Now, they had taken the necessary steps to ensure that if the issue ever flared up again, it would be handled in a way that respected their boundaries. Over the next few weeks, the tension slowly began to ease. Jill, still silent and resentful, didn't make any more overt attempts to escalate things. It was as though her decision to avoid mediation had brought some closure to the situation. Though the relationship between the narrator and Jill remained strained, the narrator was no longer consumed by anxiety. They had done everything they could to protect themselves and their property, and they had learned invaluable lessons along the way. The experience had changed the narrator. It had taught them the importance of standing firm in their convictions, the necessity of setting and enforcing boundaries, and the value of knowing when to seek outside help to resolve conflicts. The power dynamic had shifted, and the narrator could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that they had regained control over their life and their space. Though the tension would likely linger, the narrator knew they had done what was necessary to protect themselves, and that, in the end, was all they could do.